Hello, this is Ken Gitari. Welcome to Uncle Ken channel. Today we're going to talk about economics. Specifically, we're going to talk about macroeconomics. Most people, when they think about economics, if they have never studied economics before, they think economics is about money. But not really. Economics is about, it's broader than that. It's more about human behavior, how humans behave. However, today we're going to look at macroeconomics. Another time we'll look at microeconomics. So, what is macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is the study of a whole economy. For example, the UK or Brazil, Russia, China, Zambia, Mozambique. All those are economies. You could even have an economy for a region. London itself, the London city is an economy, or Southeast England, or even Bedford County itself is an economy. So, to understand economics, let's assume you are a consulting economist. Because although you are a student, you may be a student of economics. The way to understand economics is to think like a consulting economist. Let's say you've taken a flight from London Heathrow or JKF or whichever city or Nairobi, and you've flown into Zambia, the capital of Zambia, Lusaka, a beautiful country. And you've been given a job to go and look at their macroeconomic problems. Now, you're like a doctor, so you're going to try to diagnose what is ailing the Zambian economy. So the first thing you may do, even before you land in Lusaka, Zambia, is look at the data. And as you go into Zambia, you have an idea of what the problems might be. You might look at data from Statista, from the World Bank, from International Monetary Fund, from United Nations. You might watch news online, on TV. All that is going to have to give you an overview. Once you reach Zambia, you land, you might want to look at the actual data. Now, what type of data are you going to look at? And these are the symptoms of the economy. You might look at inflation rates. You might look at economic growth. Is it slowing? You might look at environmental degradation. You might look at poverty, inequality. You might look at the current account balance, the imbalance between imports and exports. Those are what we call macroeconomic problems. You diagnose that, and then you decide, oh, yeah, there's a problem here. So you formulate some objectives which you can achieve as an economist. Maybe one of them is to grow the economy. That's an objective. Reduce environmental degradation, reduce poverty and inequality, maybe reduce the current account deficit. Those are what is called macroeconomic objectives. So you have an objectives to look at, to achieve. How do you achieve those objectives? Now, you achieve those objectives using tools, macroeconomic tools. And there are various tools. What we call tools in macroeconomics are called policies, policy tools. There are two major types of tools. One of them is called the demand side policies. The other one is the supply side policies. For the demand side policies, there are normally two, you could say about three. One of them is monetary policy. The other one is fiscal policy. And the other one could be exchange rate policy. Now, monetary policy involves either increasing or decreasing interest rates. In other words, trying to deal with the money supply. The supply is too high, the money supply is too high, that's a problem. If it's too low, that's a problem. And then you've got fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is about government spending and taxation. So if you increase taxation or reduce taxation, increase government spending, reduce government spending. So basic students of macroeconomics will tell you what that is. Now, but we'll be looking this in the future on separate topics. Now, the third one is the supply side policies. That involves increasing the productive capacity of an economy. So, like education, improving healthcare, infrastructure, and all that. In other words, improving the productivity of a country's economy, the labor force, and all that. That means for students of macroeconomics, the demand side policies normally focuses on the aggregate demand. The supply side policies normally focuses on the aggregate supply side. However, at some point they interact, and this is more complex than just that, but we'll look at that in separate topics. Now, one major challenge for the macroeconomists, now, is when you try to implement some of those policies, you might find that they actually conflict. For example, if you try to encourage economic growth because the economy is growing at a slower rate than you expect, you might find that that conflicts with environmental degradation. Because think of it this way: in China, in Zambia, one of the key major exports comprised about 70% of the export revenue for Zambia is copper, and that means there's a lot of copper mining. If you want the Zambian economy to grow, one of the things you might look at is maybe to rationalize or optimize the mining of copper. However, copper causes a lot of environmental degradation. So if you increase copper mining or production, that means also you are increasing environmental degradation. That is what is called macroeconomic policy conflicts. You might have to deal with that. And basically, that gives you a whole idea about what macroeconomics is all about. That's a skeleton. Now, all other areas of study of macroeconomics is just filling in the muscles into that skeleton. So you have now an idea about what macroeconomics is. You can actually draw a flowchart. I would like you to draw one. Start with the problems. You look at the data, then you identify the problems. Once you got the problems, you identify the objectives. You might want to prioritize problems that you need to solve. In other words, the objectives you need to achieve. You might use things like Pareto principle, 80-20 rule, or all that. And then once you identify the objectives, then you have to decide on what policy tools to use. Normally, macroeconomists use one or two or three sometimes, or tools together and try to balance them. Once you implement the policies, you might find that you have to deal with macroeconomic policy conflicts. And how you deal with it will determine the success or failure of your job as a consulting economist. Now, why is this relevant to A-level students, A-level economic students? Because actually, you are expected to learn exactly what the economists in the real world do. The only thing here is that you don't visit Zambia, for example. You're given a case study, an extract written 1 or 2 pages that will help you diagnose, identify the problems that you need to deal with, the policies, and the macro conflicts. So you do exactly what real economists do in the real world, apart from use it in class is a bit simplified. Okay, thank you very much.